Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily News for Wednesday, February 16th. Tonight, we begin our cast with the rising prices for housing, gasoline, and groceries that have pushed the annual pace of inflation above 5% for the first time in over 30 years. Statistics Canada reports inflation rose from 4.8% in December to 5.1% in January. Gasoline prices shot up 31.7% from a year ago, while grocery prices rose 6.5%. Housing prices rose 6.2%, the fastest pace since February 1990, driven by higher prices for new homes as well as rent increases. All right, turning to the Emergencies Act invoked by the Trudeau government, which has outlined the measures included in the act, including one that makes it illegal to bring children to anti-government blockades. Blockades are also not allowed at a long list of places, including Parliament Hill and surrounding streets, official residences, war monuments, airports, harbors, and border crossings. Today, Ottawa police began serving notices that protesters need to leave or they risk arrest. The bulletin says Ottawa residents are being denied access to their property and protesters are causing businesses to close. Meanwhile, in Manitoba, the RCMP say the border blockade near Emerson, which has been ongoing since last Thursday, is now ended. The protesters are leaving, and police say full access to the border is restored. No one was arrested, and police did not issue any tickets. The blockade has prevented an estimated $73 million worth of goods from crossing the border each day. Meanwhile, 4 of the 13 people arrested at the Coutts border blockade in Alberta face charges of conspiracy to murder RCMP members. Well, it looks like British Columbia will lift more COVID-19 restrictions at midnight local time. Capacity limits are being dropped for restaurants, nightclubs, fitness centers, theaters, sporting events, and indoor and outdoor gatherings. Eased restrictions mean people will be allowed to dance and mingle in public spaces again, but masks and the COVID vaccine card will still be required at organized gatherings like weddings and sports tournaments, which will resume for adults. All right, from BC restrictions to the province's salmon industry. The Pacific Salmon Commission is holding its annual meeting this week, and BC groups are calling for an independent review of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Salmon advocates say significant numbers of salmon returning to spawn in BC are being caught in southeast Alaskan fisheries. They say that's hindering Canada's efforts to preserve and rebuild historically low stocks. The Skeena Wild Conservation Trust says the 1985 treaty to manage cross-border harvesting wasn't designed to deal with climate change and stocks that are in crisis and needs to be renegotiated. Moving to Alberta now, where the Environmental Defence Advocacy Group is recommending upgrading Enbridge's new Line 78 pipeline. It says that line could handle the fuels carried by the company's Line 5 if the cross-border pipeline gets shut down. The Calgary-based company says the idea is misguided, insisting Line 78 is already full. Michigan has taken Enbridge to court, arguing Line 5 poses an ecological danger to the Straits of Mackinac. To the East Coast, the New Brunswick Nurses Union says there are nearly 1,000 total vacancies for registered nurses and nurse practitioners in the province. And it says that number is rising. A survey of its members done last June finds nurses are leaving the profession or moving out of the province because they feel working conditions have become increasingly unbearable. Meanwhile, the search operation for 12 crew members still missing after a Spanish fish trawler sank on Tuesday has been called off. Canadian rescuers found 3 more bodies, raising the death toll to 9. 3 crew members, including the captain, were rescued alive. Spain's parliament held a moment of silence at the opening of today's session for the fishermen. All right, I want to switch gears here to a new study by a group calculating progress on reconciliation with Indigenous people. It suggests non-Indigenous Canadians have developed a deeper understanding of the harms that were done by the residential school system. But it also found there is still a gap in grasping the effects of the now shuttered schools on Indigenous people today. The Canadian Reconciliation Barometer's first report includes online surveys from over 3,000 Indigenous and non-Indigenous people taken last year. All right, time for an update on Team Canada as Charles Amelin capped his Olympic career with a gold medal. The 37-year-old helped Canada win the men's 5,000-meter short track speed skating relay. It was his sixth medal, tying him with long track speed skater Cindy Klassen for the most Winter Games medals by a Canadian. Well, congratulations. All right, we'll be right back after the break with a look at the markets with Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. Stay with us. Welcome back. Up next, Forum Daily's weekly market update with Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks, Seema. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I am Catherine Murray. Well, we are seeing the TSX and U.S. markets trade mildly lower today. That does, however, follow some nice rallies yesterday on both sides of the border. With respect to the TSX, we are seeing technology stocks leading the declines, led by Shopify, which is trading down by about 18% or so today following their earnings, which had come in better than expected, but it's the outlook that is disappointing investors. We're also seeing, though, energy shares move higher on the TSX today. This, of course, follows the price of WTI, which is moving higher to the tune of about 2%, following a decline of about 3% yesterday. Importantly, as well, we are seeing the Canadian dollar moving higher against the US dollar, perhaps on the back of the price of oil also moving higher. We are so often viewed as a commodity currency. On the back of that, CAD is higher versus the US dollar. With respect to the markets and what we're seeing in terms of the movements over the past couple of days, it really has a lot to do with Russia-Ukraine headlines. Of course, perhaps the bounce back yesterday was on the back of a reprieve from those geopolitical tensions. However, today we did hear from Secretary of State Blinken saying that there is no evidence of Russia pulling back. So that's why we're in a little bit of this limbo right now. Away from that, of course, economic data is absolutely front and center this week. The U.S. 10-year yield is trading above 2%. And really holding above that 2%. That makes sense given the fact that we have seen U.S. inflation data, PPI in particular, yesterday hit 9.5%. That dovetails very nicely with what we heard from the FOMC minutes today, saying that they prefer an earlier pullback of accommodation. So do be set to see the U.S. Federal Reserve raise rates at the next meeting. Away from that as well, we have seen some very strong retail data out of the United States, beating expectations 3.8% versus 1.8% expectations. So you can see a huge beat. Why is that important? Because it's telling us that the U.S. economy is in fact strong. The U.S. consumer is strong. And maybe that's putting investors at ease that even when the U.S. Federal Reserve raises rates as expected, the U.S. economy can actually handle it. So taken together, it's a positive. We also saw U.S. industrial numbers come in better than expected as well. So it looks as though the U.S. economy is in good standing. The Canadian inflation data came in at 5.1%, the highest number we've seen since 1991. Let's also consider as well, of course, that we could see some supply disruptions from the trucker protest. That, of course, is in certain pockets of the economy. And having said that, we can also look to expect that the BOC will have a liftoff in rates at the March 2nd meeting. Again, given the fact that we've seen continued readings of inflation on the higher side. Also importantly as well, UK inflation readings, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, hit a 30-year high. Bottom line, it looks as though we're going to have some central bankers around the world raising rates. One other economic data that I think is so important to a lot of Canadians is what we're seeing on the housing front. Home prices hot for sure, up by 2.9% in January. That is the largest monthly reading on record. Away from that, in terms of some stock news to watch, Barrick, ABX is the ticker there, that is trading higher to the tune of about 7% on better than expected earnings. I briefly mentioned Shopify. Their quarterly earnings for the fourth quarter did come in better than expected on the revenue front. And I always like to put this in perspective. They generated $1.38 billion in revenue in one quarter. But the issue for the stock right now, which is trading down by 18%, is their guidance. Stocks always move on guidance. And they are saying that they're expecting slower revenue growth in 2022 versus 2021. But let's also put that in perspective. 2021 revenue growth was 57%. So clearly still a good grower. We also saw TRP or TC Energy, the former TransCanada. They came in with their earnings yesterday, had a couple couple of downgrades today. Raymond James for one, but they still have a $67.50 price target on the stock, but the stock is trading down by about 1%. A lot of people own those. And we also heard from Smart Center, Morguard, and CT REIT. They also came in with better earnings versus expectations. So certainly earnings are heating up here in Canada. They have been and continue to do so. Mixed results pretty much across the board. One last thing I'll leave you with, the bullish sentiment is on the lower side, but often that is viewed as contrarian indicator. I'm taking as a positive. Nima, back to you.
All right, thanks for that, Catherine. For more analysis and news on the markets, be sure to tune in to Catherine Murray on the Buck Stops here. All right, coming up after the break, we take a look at Canada's skyrocketing inflation. That and, of course, more news from around the world only on Forum Daily News. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Statistics Canada says the annual pace of inflation topped 5% for the first time in more than 30 years. The agency says the annual inflation rate rose to 5.1% in January, compared with a gain of 4.8% in December. Driving much of the increase in January were prices for housing, gasoline, and groceries. Gasoline prices were up over 31% last month compared with January 2021. Excluding gasoline prices, Statistics Canada says the annual rate of inflation would have been 4.3% in January. Grocery prices increased year over year by 6.5%, making for the largest yearly increase since May 2009. With us to discuss the inflationary increases and how they will impact Canadians is Mr. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Now, inflation is at a 30-year high, Mr. Terrazzano. We mentioned some stats off in the intro, but really bring this home to our Canadian viewers. How will this directly impact the cost of living for Canadian taxpayers?
Well, we're seeing inflation that is at a 3 decades high. So this rising cost of living is really becoming one of the key economic issues facing Canadians' day-to-day lives. And what is so unfortunate is that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the federal government could immediately make life a little more affordable by providing tax relief. But we're seeing Ottawa do the exact opposite, making the tough times tougher with higher taxes during the middle of a pandemic.
Now, the three main factors here seem to be the housing issue, gasoline, and groceries. So why are prices rising quickly for these three items in particular, sir?
Well, I think let's start by focusing on gasoline, just because it impacts so much of everybody's day-to-day life. And we have to remember that taxes can make up between 31 and 42% of the pump price, depending on the province. And we also have to remember that the carbon tax has already increased twice during the pandemic. It's getting set to increase again to 11 cents per liter in April. But the Trudeau government isn't stopping there. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says that he wants to raise his carbon tax to nearly 40 cents per liter by 2030.
Some very troubling news for Canadian wallets there, sir. Now, are some parts of the country experiencing worse inflation than other areas?
Yeah, there are some provinces that are getting hit a little bit harder. You have Prince Edward Island that is seeing rising inflation. You also have Ontario and Manitoba. For those latter two provinces, Ontario, Manitoba, you see higher electricity prices that are really driving those increases. But of course, in many provinces and some big cities, you're also seeing some sky-high housing costs, which are really impacting some would-be first-time home buyers.
And why is this the case, Mr. Terrazzano? Why are some regions and cities more affected than others?
Well, it's tough to really go into specific regions. Of course, we mentioned Ontario, Manitoba, you're seeing higher electricity prices. But one thing that impacts all Canadians from coast to coast is the printing press. During the pandemic, we've seen the Bank of Canada print $370 billion. And the more dollars that the Bank of Canada creates out of thin air, the less that your dollars in your bank accounts, in your retirement savings will buy. And one of the key issues that we have is that the Bank of Canada is printing new dollars out of thin air, but of course it can't print up new homes or new farmland out of thin air.
All right, sir, just over a minute left here, but let's talk solutions. What are some meaningful measures that the federal government can actually take to address this rising inflation?
I'll give you three. Number one, we just talked about it. Stop printing so much money. Number two, we have to see the federal government rein in the massive amount of government borrowing and the unprecedented amount of government spending. And number three, give us a much needed tax relief. The first rule of government during these type of tough times is to do no harm. But like I said, we're seeing the federal government make these tough times tougher with higher taxes.
It's interesting how Canada compares to other countries. I know in a recent press release you mentioned that governments worldwide are actually cutting taxes. So what sorts of taxes are they cutting?
Yeah, well, we've seen South Korea reduce gas taxes by 20%. India also reducing taxes. You have Spain, France reducing electricity taxes. UK, Italy, Poland, Sri Lanka also reducing taxes. Even south of the border, you have 11 American states cutting income or business taxes. So other countries are providing their citizens with relief, but Ottawa is giving us higher tax bills.
All right, Mr. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thanks again for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, stay with us. Up next, news from around the world. Ukraine's president calls a National Unity Day holiday, and the EU's highest court rules that the bloc can link financial backing to the rule of law. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up shortly on Forum Daily News. We'll be back. Ukraine's president called a National Unity Day holiday today in the face of a possible Russian invasion. Western leaders continue to insist they see no sign of a promised pullback of Russian troops from Ukraine's borders. This despite Kremlin declarations of a withdrawal. Ukraine's president says this is a day for all Ukrainians to come together, fly flags, and sing the national anthem in a show of defiance and solidarity. Well, this comes as the European Union's highest court has ruled that the 27-nation bloc can link financial backing for member states to respect for rule of law. It said that a challenge by Hungary and Poland should be dismissed. The right-wing governments of both nations had argued that such action lacked a proper legal basis. Both nations are large recipients of EU funds, and they have come under increasing criticism over the past few years. This for veering away from the Western principles of the respect for democratic values in their nations. To the east, hospitals in Hong Kong are struggling to keep up with an influx of new coronavirus patients. This comes amid record numbers of new infections as the city adheres to its zero-COVID strategy. In comments published Wednesday, China's leader Xi Jinping weighed in. He said it is the local government's overriding task to control the situation. Hong Kong is currently facing its worst outbreak of the pandemic, topping 2,000 new COVID-19 cases each day this week. Healthcare facilities are beginning to overflow, forcing the city's Kritas Medical Center to resort to treating some patients in beds outside the building. Back in Europe, Germany's leaders have announced plans to end most of the country's coronavirus restrictions by March 20th. The decision coincided with moves by neighboring Austria and Switzerland to drop many of their virus curbs sooner. A three-step plan was endorsed Wednesday by Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the country's 16 state governors. This comes as official figures show Germany's COVID-19 infection rate beginning to drift downward. As of Thursday, Switzerland will not require mask wearing or vaccine passports to enter shops and other public settings. In the Middle East, a surprise ruling by Iraq's High Court has cast doubt on the legal foundations of the independent oil policy of Iraq's Kurdish-run region. And officials warned Wednesday that it's threatening to drive a political wedge between the two governments. Iraq's Supreme Court on Tuesday struck down the legal justifications for the semi-autonomous region's oil policy. The ruling comes during a politically sensitive time as efforts have stalled in Iraq to form a government. Over in West Africa, Burkina Faso's junta leader, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henri Sandaogo Damibe, has been sworn in as president on Wednesday, less than a month after leading a coup. The inauguration ceremony, not open to the general public, was held at the Constitutional Court. The newly minted president spoke to the nation on state television after taking the oath. Lieutenant Colonel Damibe has promised to secure the war-torn country from growing jihadi violence linked to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group, which has killed thousands and displaced more than 1.5 million people. All right, turning to the growing issue of intimate partner violence, as the World Health Organization says 27% of women around the world have experienced this. Researchers analyzed all available data between the year 2000 and 2018. This is including more than 300 studies and responses from 2 million women. They found that about 1 in 4 women globally are estimated to have experienced physical or sexual or both intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Analysts say the report brings attention to an important global issue, especially because the pandemic, with its lockdowns and tensions, has led to a spike in intimate partner violence. Moving to Brazil, where local authorities say the death toll from mudslides and floods that swept through a mountainous region of Rio de Janeiro has reached at least 58. The city of Petrópolis was struck by a deluge on Tuesday, and there are fears the toll could rise higher as searchers check damaged areas Wednesday. The department says the area got just over 10 inches of rain within 3 hours. All right, we end the cast with a positive development in the fight against HIV. A U.S. patient with HIV is believed to be the 3rd person and 1st woman to be cured of the virus. She has been free of the virus for 14 months. She received a stem cell transplant from someone with a natural resistance to HIV. However, experts say the transplant method, involving umbilical cord blood, is too risky for most people with HIV. But the case is considered to prove and reinforce the idea that a cure for HIV is possible. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website. Take care, Canada. See you next time.